Okay, we're on. We have to kind of hurry tonight because Mr. Venari tells me we're on battery. We're on battery. I don't have one. I figure if I keep talking, eventually somebody will listen. But I found when I was teaching and I couldn't speak if I spoke really, really quietly, which I had to. The students would quiet down and listen. In fact, they'd be shushing each other up. So the real secret to get people to listen is to make sure they can barely hear you. So anyway, our problem, I understand, is we have a battery difficulty here, and if the battery goes dead, I have to wrap up real quick. So, well, let's get started. On page 46, we're just beginning to deal with civil authority, unless you have any questions pertinent to food distribution. The thing to remember is that ultimately this is God's world, and all authority comes from Him. It is delegated de facto through His creation of human nature. So it's the way that we are existentially constituted that determines what kind of authority structure we need to have. So whenever you're trying to examine what is a philosopher looking for in terms of an explanation of anything, the derivation ultimately is from God. It is ultimately through our human nature. It is ultimately through the reason, the rational faculties which God has given us to reflect upon our nature to see what the exigencies of that nature would be, in this case in reference to the constitution of government. And so civil authority, the origin of it, comes from the will of the people. Now, of course, that doesn't mean will in the sense of contract theory. It isn't that you can contract any kind of set of laws that you want, because if they violate natural law, they don't really exist. They're non-existent laws, non-binding laws. The object of the will of the people in forming a government has to be the common good. This is important because we have a lot of people today who are kind of in what you call the conservative movement. But people sometimes forget that there are different kinds of conservative. I'm a conservative, yes, but what I mean by that is I am a natural law conservative. I follow what natural law would dictate. Libertarians are also called conservatives, but they do not necessarily follow what natural law dictates. They are concerned about the freedom of the individual and about the state protecting that freedom and protecting individuals to conduct their normal affairs of life. That's all to the good. They recognize that the state is responsible for the defense of the nation and for the conduct of foreign policy, but basically that's about it. And anything beyond that on the part of government is really unwanted unnecessarily and an interference with human freedom. That sounds very good as far as it goes. The difficulty arises when you deal with something like the issue of abortion. Should we permit people to have abortions? Well, it depends on, libertarians would say that you have to protect this health and welfare of the people, the safety of the people, that's true. But where you have a controversy about what constitutes a human being or how we ought to treat that human being, the libertarians ultimately don't have a way of resolving the conflict. Because to resolve it, you have to come to a knowledge of the truth about when human life begins. It isn't just a matter of contending political philosophies where one can have a legitimate disagreement. There's no way to resolve it. And so you have some libertarians who do oppose abortion, that's true, but many others don't. Many of them would permit the use of drugs like marijuana and heroin and so forth in the name of individual liberty. So we, following natural law, are required to serve the common good. And the common good is understood by an analysis of human nature. And therefore, the common good would require, for example, that society have laws that restrict and protect the institution of marriage. From a libertarian standpoint, why would you? Let people do what they want. So it makes a big difference what you understand human nature to be, what you understand its properties to be, and that in framing a government for the service of the common good, you design a societal system which promotes those values that are consonant with human nature. And that's why, yes, ultimately you want to leave room for speculation and the arts and history and museums and universities. That's all part of it. And indeed, we should be promoting that. Sister.
Would you say that our founding fathers were likely libertarian?
I don't really think so, no. I think that would be prior to some of the libertarian movement, first of all. And secondly, many of them...
to the Ten Commandments, so that would,
yeah,
would that make them conservative? Natural law conservative?
They would, yes, I would say they would be more close to doing that, because they, after all, they talk about the things that have been given to us by nature's God, and how he has designed by providence the nature of the world and so forth. Some of them were deists. They thought God just created the world and set it on its way. But at the same time, many of them had much more traditional views, and that's why the idea that separation of church and state should mean that God should have no place in the affairs of anybody is consummately contradicted, because the Congress begins all of its, and has since the founding, its sessions with prayers to God. So clearly the view of the Founding Fathers was much more traditional and certainly not libertarian in the contemporary sense. Yes, many of them were Masons. I don't want to get off onto that tack, if you don't mind. I would point out that many of them, I mean, at that time, if you wanted to get anywhere in society, you had to be a Mason. So, and it was predominantly Protestant country. So, what's your problem? We won't go there. Forms of civil authority. You notice there's 6 of them listed here, and they're mirror images of each other. You have monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Those are the 3 good ones. And then you've got tyranny, oligarchy, and anarchy, and those are the 3 bad ones. Basically, if you stop and think about it, the most efficient form of government is a monarchy. One person at the top. If he rules according to natural law and with great wisdom, you got it made. You got the best possible form of government. It's the most efficient. You don't have to fight things through a legislature. You don't have contending political parties. Everything's peace and decorum and happiness. But, of course, it presupposes the virtue and the wisdom and the knowledge of the monarch. Could be a dictator. Doesn't matter. If by the will of the people they accept him, it'd be fine. The difficulty is, given the nature of human beings since the fall, we are much more likely to wind up with tyranny or despotism or a dictatorship in the worst sense of the word, like Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin. That, as it says there, that's an evil monarchy. And it's the worst of all worlds because so much power is concentrated in the hands of one man. Then we have the aristocracy, which is the rule of the best. And this was the kind of thing that you had more or less in ancient Greece. It was, it is a reasonable thing if you have a cultured class and the people accept them, and they are the best educated people and they possess virtue. Where's the problem? Well, the problem is, again, human nature, the fall, original sin, whatever you want to call it, and what it turns out to be in most cases is an oligarchy, which is the rule of the worst. Concentration of power not in one person, but in a ruling class, and where they are essentially functioning like a glorified mafia, things don't go too well. And then finally you have democracy, which is the rule of the people, or a republic, wherein in most of the cases, of course, you're not going to have a true democracy, but you will have a republic where you have, as in the United States, the people vote for representatives, and the representatives then rule the people in the name of the people. That's democracy. That leads to a lot of contention and a lot of confusion. And of course, you see the correspondence there is anarchy. It says the people gone mad. Well, this is what can happen if you have a democracy that runs amok, that passes all kinds of laws, positive state absolutism. They pass unlimited laws which ultimately make society itself ungovernable, and you descend into a state of anarchy. It's easy to mess up the whole process, as we have seen, even in our own time.
Why do you have a natural law anarchy? There is no overarching governance structure.
Yeah,
the people haven't gone mad.
Oh, you mean could you have a natural law anarchy? Well, of course, the word anarchy itself, as it says, indicates the people are out of control.
No, it's without government.
Well, the problem with that, as we'll see on the next page, is you can't organize civil society in an efficient way without some kind of structure. And you can't have a structure if you don't have some kind of governance and order.
Well, why would you need to organize society as a whole?
Why
can't you have communities of people who get together who self-govern themselves?
Well, how do they self-govern?
By working as a community and sorting.
How do they decide what to do? How do they get their act together? This is like telling 100 soldiers, go charge that hill. Just go do it. You don't need any lieutenants. You don't need a captain.
It's conceivable the soldiers will get together. They'll come up with a plan. They will appoint temporary leaders.
Temporary leaders.
But not an overarching governing structure.
If you have a temporary leader, you've got some kind of governance. The moment you allow that somebody gives the direction, you have governance by definition.
No, because that leader can be deposed at any time the community decides.
All right, we can depose a king too.
Sure.
You can always do that, but the very essence of having a lot of people doing something at the same time requires some kind of order, or you have chaos. And the only way we can avoid chaos is we have to have some concurrence as to what we're going to do, and to concur in what we're doing, we have to establish some kind of structure. You have to have some kind of rule. If you're going to have a rule, you got to have some way of enforcing it, which brings you back to having some kind of legislative or judicial branch. We do it on a small scale. Use the example of having 100 soldiers try to charge a hill randomly. They're going to get themselves killed. That's why you have to have some kind of order and structure. But when you talk about few communities, when you talk about 300 million Americans, it would be a little bit difficult to organize the entire structure of the nation without structure. How on earth would you ever decide on something like an interstate commerce, an interstate highway system? How would you decide to build it? Would each community decide on how many feet it wants to do itself, and then we'll stop at the border because we don't want to go any further? This is why it's utopian. It's unworkable. In the practical order, mankind has found he has to have governments. The problem is, what is going to be the nature of the government? Democracy, it's kind of a two-edged sword. Why do we have democracy when monarchy's better? Simple reason. We don't trust the monarch. We've had our fill of monarchs. And basically, we've come to the conclusion that if you elect representatives, if you have the people voting for their own government, at least they can control it, at least you hope. One of the difficulties you have is you want to operate according to the truth. But who has the truth? In a completely natural human environment, we don't ultimately trust that one person has all of the truth. And that's one of the things that you would really kind of have to do it with a monarch. Now, he could appoint advisors. Ideally, it could be done. But in practice, we don't trust it to work that way, and that's why the default position is democracy or a republic. It's not perfect, but our human existence in this world is not perfect either. The presumption is that if a parliament or a legislature discusses all the various alternatives, has committees seeking input from experts, that they will, in honesty, pursue the truth, and upon finding it, enact it by vote. Now, of course, you and I know it doesn't work that way, but that's the theory. And indeed, as I think somebody said, it's the worst of all forms of government except every other form. You have to think about that. Point C. Why is there need for authority? Well, this is just what we're talking about. Well, anywhere there's a common good. Common good means there are certain specific ends that need to be sought. Among the common goods are peace, tranquility, educatedness, justice, and so forth. But in order to achieve those, we need some kind of centralized authority. Now, that doesn't mean a tyrant. When you say centralized authority, it means just what it says. It's up to us as human beings to create a centralized authority which is in conformity with natural law, that is, with human nature, and with human nature's relationship to its creator. Responsibility implies authority. Somebody's got to be responsible for keeping that structure together, for the rules that we agree to. And if you're going to be responsible for it, there has to be some kind of authority. And all that goes with authority, all that's implied with authority. If nobody's responsible for maintaining a rule would not last longer than you enacted it, because everybody would still go his own way. Top of page 47. Here you got the more metaphysical foundation for it. Point number 3. Why do we need authority? Well, in order to achieve good order, which is ordered towards an end. An order means setting out many things with one goal. And human life is complex. I mean, you're talking about millions of people, thousands of individual villages or towns or cities. You're talking about a coordination of efforts within one nation. If they're not at all coordinated, I submit you don't have one nation. The whole idea of having one nation is there is a certain level of, shall we say, federal coordination. You can follow subsidiarity. You can have smaller units that take care of smaller units of authority and serve smaller segments of common good. And that's why you have states, and you have counties, and you have cities, and you have villages. That's fine, and that's a natural hierarchy, a natural tier formation by which society operates effectively. But if you're going to have any order in the society, you need some structure of authority. So, and beyond that, look at A, B, C, and D here, order must be promulgated. There's got to be some way when we discern what we are going to do as a community for the common good, this has to be made known to everybody who's within the community. And that of course, is why central government has to have some means of, even if you were doing it by horseback riders, at some point in time you had to be able to let people know what the law was, what had been agreed to. Even in the founding of the United States, I mean, you had a Continental Congress, and they had to meet and drop a constitution or whatever they were going to establish a government with, and then they'd send this back out to the various colonies or early states. You had to let them know by horseback riders what had been agreed to. And then people had to be bound to it. If they weren't bound to it, ultimately you had a rebellion again. And we did have rebellions. Societies always tend to have rebellions. But somebody's going to say, I don't want to go along with it. But the only way you can keep a cohesive state, a cohesive nation, is if you have a general agreement generally to follow common laws and to follow an established order of government to which we owe allegiance. Short of that, you do wind up, practically speaking, in anarchy. And anarchy is well known for, you wind up with riots in the streets, people looting, looters being shot on sight. By whom are they shot? Usually by the army representing the government. If not, they're shot by the shop owners. But somebody's got to shoot them. Otherwise, all your TV sets would be gone. Can't have that happen. B, principle of subsidiarity. I already mentioned it. That's the hierarchy that you build into society. And you don't want the higher doing what the lower can do. You don't want responsibility at a higher level when it can be handled at a lower level. But there are some things that have to be handled at the highest level. That's the point. You can't have the mayor of Niagara Falls conducting foreign policy for Niagara Falls independent of what the whole country's doing. Again, most of this is simply common sense. C, and this answers to some extent the question that you raised, there can be no coordination without subordination. How do you coordinate people's activity if you don't have some kind of an organizing principle and some subordination to that? You can't even have a picnic, where everybody's going to bring things. Somebody's got to coordinate what they bring. You don't want to have 100 hams, and that's all.
But if I'm somebody living in California, why would I even care to coordinate in any way with somebody living in New York?
Well, if you don't want to, start a revolution. Because, that's the bottom line.
Why would I want to?
Maybe don't.
Just to coordinate parochially.
The Americans didn't want to coordinate with the British, and they solved that problem, didn't they? But that is your alternative. Your alternative is you won't have one country. You won't have one nation. You can always do that.
I think there's a good point to be made here. There's no subordination in the free market, and we don't run out of chickens in the supermarket.
No, and there's no.
Make sure that there's enough chickens there. There always are.
Okay, you make a good point, but it is true that if nobody's making chickens, the government might have to encourage somebody to do it.
Not in the free market.
Well, there is a limit.
Clean fascism market.
Oh, okay, but I think what you're doing is defending a notion of market economy, which itself may be defective. A totally free market. I'm all for free markets, don't misunderstand me. But if you have a free market that is totally free, you will wind up with the social barons of the late 19th century.
No way.
Well, it happened. It happened.
Was it a free market?
Well, because that's right, they controlled the market. The function of government then was to make sure they didn't form monopolies. And that means you don't have a completely free market. I know what you're saying. If everybody kind of does his own thing, and I'm all for that, that's not a problem.
Prices coordinate the whole market.
But if, as a result of everybody doing his own thing, people wound up starving somewhere, and I quite agree, a properly functioning market, this won't happen. But if somebody were to wind up starving somewhere, the government has a responsibility to see to the health and safety of the people. Now, you're saying it would never happen. Fine. If it doesn't happen, we don't have a problem, do we?
How do they do that without stealing?
How do they do it without stealing?
How do they see that people get food without stealing from people who have food?
Well, again, the problem is the right to private property so absolute that you're allowed to allow your neighbor to steal when you have excess? That's an absolutist notion of private property. And I don't think you can ultimately sustain that in natural law. Ultimately, you can't.
I don't think you can defend stealing.
I agree you can't defend stealing, but the point is, if the right to private property is not absolute, then there are conditions in which the taking of another's property isn't stealing.
Only when you're the
You're not a thief under some conditions. If you're, we don't like to use these examples, but it does happen conceivably. Somebody is starving and somebody's got 100 chickens and they don't eat them all. You have a natural right to stay alive. You may not have the right to kill the guy who's got the chickens, though, to get the chicken. That's another matter.
You have a right to sweat your brow and do some work.
Everybody agrees that that would be preferable, but not in every circumstance is it possible.
You don't work, you don't eat.
But if you can't get a job, you can't work.
Lower your pay. You'll get a job.
No, the guy that's hungry.
I'm talking about the guy.
This is
who's hungry.
economic theory.
I had a professor, Spanish professor, and when he came to the United States
help us
from
here?
Cuba, all right? He came, but he said as a child, they were so hungry, but I think he might have been in Spain at that time. He said he had to steal food because they didn't have work and he didn't have food.
Okay, what we're getting into here is the economic theory as to what will actually function. But the general principle at issue is that if you have a government, it must see to the basic needs of society in some way. How exactly you do it, how you recognize property rights, okay, let's put it to a legislature. I agree, you got to follow natural law. I'm not trying to answer every single objection that you can possibly raise. But the idea that you can have a total, anybody doing whatever they want, ultimately the problem with that is people will interfere with other people's rights. And that's why one of the functions of government, as we'll see, is to remove impediments to the free exercise of activity. And that's why if somebody is tending to become a robber baron, society has a concern about it, and the government represents the society. And that's why there has to ultimately be some way to handle situations that are completely out of control. I'm all in favor of a free market, and in fact, the function of government is to make sure that you get a free market that functions freely with and also respects human rights at the same time. So in that respect, there's ultimately has to be somebody who makes that determination. And if you want to call that regulation, okay, that's regulation. You can't have a society without some rules. The problem is that many times people look at what is a perversion of the use of a rule and say, well, you shouldn't have a rule because it's been misused. Okay, rules get misused. Instead of good kings, we get dictators and tyrants. Instead of a good democracy, we get a runaway absolute state positivism that enacts laws violating human nature right and left. That doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean we can do away with government completely. We need to have government, but it needs to be structured based on natural law. And the fact that we don't have governments doing this, that's the scandal of our present human condition. This is what we have to work toward. Will we get there? I don't know. Maybe not in this world. Point D, a common effect requires a common cause. This comes down to metaphysics. You can't get ultimately the service of the common good. In other words, if you grant that we're obligated to seek the common good, if that flows from human nature, then we have to have a cause which will produce that common good. And the point is, notice, you can't get a common effect without a common cause. What that means is you have to have a cause that is ordered to a common effect. Now, how do you have a cause that's ordered to a common effect? Are you or I individually that cause? If we are, we're the king, we're the monarch. But you can't be the monarch and I be the monarch at the same time. And that's why we have to have some kind of a common cause, which is a governmental system to which all consent, either explicitly or implicitly, by not fomenting a rebellion and by not emigrating. There's two ways you can withdraw your consent from the government. You can stage an armed insurrection or you can leave the country. But if you don't do that, you're implicitly affirming your consent to the status that we're living under, the acceptance of the laws we're living under. So this idea of the need for a government is not just arbitrary. I'm not just saying it because, natural law says it. Natural law says it because of the nature of man, because of the nature of what you need to do to coordinate activity to achieve the common good, which we are obliged to seek as a society. So it's not invented. Anytime you start arbitrarily inventing your system, you are engaged in positivism. Not referring to materialism, but referring to the idea that it's the product of will. You either base what you're doing on will or it's based on human nature. Human nature comes from God. We don't make it up. We have to live according to it. According to will, you could do anything you want. We could legalize rape. Why not? Under social contract theory, you could. Unless your social contract is to follow natural law. But that's not what we call contract theory. Joe, did you have?
No, that's correct.
Okay. D, properties of authority. This is kind of what I've been saying. Domestic society flows out of man's nature and the divine plan. Now, this is very different, mind you, than what you're getting from scientific materialists today. Scientific materialists don't recognize that man has a nature superior to the rest of the animal kingdom. I know, I've just been debating with some of these people on the internet, and it's interesting to see what you run into. It's a different mindset completely. God doesn't exist. The world's always been here in some form. It's a product of random interaction of subatomic particles. Ultimately, nothing really exists above them. You think you exist, but you don't. They think they exist, but they don't, according to their own theory. But that's another issue. Ultimately, man is just one species among many species. And there is ultimately no moral right or wrong. There's really no basis for it. And if there isn't, then, as Dostoevsky says, if there is no God, if there is no heaven, if there is no hell, then anything's permissible. So ultimately, government, whatever we do, it's what we want. It's what we will, what we agree to. Oftentimes these people, I'm talking about the scientific materialists, will say they hold lofty ethical standards, but what's the basis of it? Except their common consent, their common agreement as to the values they will hold as being important. And this is why we see, of course, today, the ecological movement being used to suppress human dignity and rights down to the level of worms or snail darters. Ultimately, if you're getting in the way of the Environmental Protection Act, we'll shut down your farm. We'll shut down your mill. You can go out of existence. You can die if you want, but don't get in the way of the snail darter. Don't bother a little fish swimming upstream. He's got to be able to jump up, and if you kill one of them, God help you. It's all right to kill your own unborn, of course. That's all right. You got a right to do that. But don't, whatever you do, don't kill a snail darter. This is how screwed up we've gotten ourselves. And it is precisely because we've lost sight of natural law. We've lost sight that God does exist and God creates the world, and He's given to things a natural hierarchy, an order, a dignity, a perfection, an existential ordering from the lower to the higher, and they're real. And man has a right of dominion over the rest of the world and over other animal species, because man alone possesses a spiritual and immortal soul, an intellect and a will that these creatures do not have, and has an immortal and eternal destiny in the beatific vision with God, if he leads his life properly in this world. But you can see how many people today are probably quite lost because they've lost that vision. They've lost those truths. You can't live your life if you don't know the truth. And if you think you're nothing but a glorified snail darter or microbe, you really are in a bad way. You don't know where you're going, and Of course, ultimately, there's no basis for authority or order in the world because you've taken away the principle of order, the ultimate authority, which is God himself. And so you will wind up with chaos. And you wind up with everybody doing his own thing. And nobody, you wind up with a little clique, some kind of oligarchy, telling you what you're going to do, and telling you what your values will be, and telling you that your religious conscience can't get in the way of a health care law, right? Telling you that you don't even have the right to dissent because you object on religious grounds.
How's that different from 51% of the people telling you the same thing?
You're old enough. I think you remember taking a civics class many years ago, at least I do, where they talked about majority rule and what went with it.
They talked about tyranny of the majority, what I was listening to.
Yeah, but what went with the majority rule? Do you remember that? Well, maybe you're younger than I am.
Protection of individual rights.
Yeah.
Supposedly.
The short form was majority rule, but minority rights. And it was understood at that time, I'm talking about 60 years ago, it was understood at that time that you were talking about inalienable rights given to us by our Creator. That's what protects us from the 51%. And that's what libertarianism misses. That's why you can't just enact any law you want. You can't enact a law contrary to the natural law. If you do, it's a pseudo-law. It's not real and it's not deserving of respect. And what you do about it when you've got a society where you've elected leaders, as we have, who are enacting laws that will suppress and ignore and violate individual conscience, where people don't want to participate in abortion, don't want to pay for abortions, and you've got a president right now who's telling you you're going to do it like it or not. This is implicitly a totalitarian form of government. Any government which arrogates to the state the absolute right to take over the decisions that violate the most intimate, basic rights of conscience of the individual, such a form has created the total state. And the total state is totalitarianism. It doesn't matter that it looks like parliamentary democracy. The form doesn't preserve it from being totalitarian because you have violated the very nature of a natural state recognizing the rights of all human beings. And that's why, yes, 51% can rule. And unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is the danger that 51% may violate the rights of the minority. And in so doing, make its rule illegitimate in truth. It ultimately becomes a rule which is backed only by the gun and not by what is right. We in here are trying to talk about what is morally right. We're trying to talk about how you would structure a society properly. Ideally, it may not actually exist. And unfortunately, the United States of America today is right on the edge of losing the very concept of a natural law society that I would say the Founding Fathers had in mind. And that's why the Founding Fathers said, yes, you've got a republic, but it presupposes the virtue of the people, and when the people lose their virtue, you'll lose your republic. These are very dangerous times that we're living in. And it's not purely academic, it's not purely speculative, as you all know. We're actually determining the future of our society and of all societies. All right, so from God, God creates man. Man has certain properties. The properties flowing from human nature. For the individual, we are self-governing. That's what individual ethics is all about. We're supposed to govern ourselves. But that doesn't mean self-license. That doesn't mean we've got the right to do anything we want. It means we are to govern ourselves according to natural law. That's what the whole study of ethics is about. We use reason to reflect on our nature so that we conform our behavior to our nature as created by God. You don't have the right to act like a snail darter. because you're not one. You don't have the right to behave like a monkey because you're not one. You don't have the right to go out like a lion and eat your neighbor because you're not one. You're a human being, and as a human being, you have an obligation to your nature and to your nature's creator to act with dignity and in conformity with natural law. So self-governing, yes, that doesn't mean absolute autonomy of the will. The will must conform to the proper object of the good, which the intellect understands. That's why God gave us a mind to understand what is right, or to seek it. Every human being has an obligation to seek the truth. Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. But when you examine it, you're supposed to figure out what it's about, find out the truth, and live according to it. It isn't something that we are free, remember? We're physically, psychologically free to do anything we want, but we're not morally free to do anything we want. We are morally obligated to live according to the nature that God gave us. So yes, self-governance, but that means, for example, in relation to the world, you don't have to be an ecological nutcase in order to realize that we have an obligation of stewardship to the world. If you own something, that legally means you have the right to destroy it. But do you morally have the right to do that with everything you own? If you own 10 pigs, legally you've got the right, because you own them, to shoot them, depending on the laws we now have. But morally, does that make it right? No. God gave us a mind. We're expected to use it reasonably. Stewardship. If you have to put an animal to death, should you do it in the most painful way possible? Does the animal have a right not to suffer? No, it doesn't. Animals don't have any rights at all. But you and I, as human beings, have an obligation to act according to reason, and to cause senseless, useless pain to any creature is irrational and immoral because of our nature, not because of its nature. Domestic society, political society, again, the moment you have a number of people involved, you're going to need some kind of government. And where you have society, you have more than one person. And that's why even in the marital society, the domestic society, there are rules, obligations husband and wife have to each other in virtue of their special role as co-procreators of the human race. You can't just make up any rules you want. Again, you've always got people coming in and telling you, you can do anything you want. Use birth control, have abortion. You don't have to be stuck married to the same person your whole life. There's always people telling you this, and many people listening, and many people have listened in the last 50 years, and look what it's gotten us for society. It's led to the breakdown of the family. It's led to the breakdown of society. It's led to unwed mothers. It's led to relationships where you have two mothers or two fathers. You're trying to raise children properly, and it doesn't work. We have the social statistics to prove it now. We've had 50 years of experimenting. We've tried all this stuff, and all that we have is anarchy and chaos and social degradation. Yes, in the 1950s, there were all kinds of strictures. We were very straight-laced, relatively, not really, but it looked like compared to today. But you did have a stability of society you don't have today. You didn't have a situation, as we just saw in Chicago, where children are being shot randomly in the streets by gangs, killed. In fact, interesting thing, remember? No, okay, you're not as old as I am, some of you. Back in the 1930s, I was born during the Great Depression. That's old. Back during the 1930s, the gangsters in the early 30s were shooting each other all over the place. And one day, amazingly, it was in Chicago, they had a child was killed. And it so shocked the nation that they instituted firm reforms. They were able to do this. But just think of the difference in the mentality. The people just knew how horrific this was, and they actually did something about it as a nation. Today we just wring our hands and ask the mafia to be gentlemen. It doesn't work too well. Point number 3, the ultimate foundation of all authority is God's nature. So you go right back up to the top. The divine plan, which gives rise to natural law. Remember the eternal law? That's God knowing from all eternity everything that is or can be or what he wills for all eternity. Natural law is us reading it. He gave us the book. The book is our intellect, to look at our nature and to understand. Now, of course, you and I both know, all of us know, that people don't read the natural law very well. And that's one of the arguments as to why we needed revelation, religious revelation, to give people things like the 10 Commandments, to give them some guidance. They weren't the 10 suggestions. They're the 10 Commandments, and if you go back and look at them, people think, oh, that's so restrictive. I never could figure out why the Israelites kept wanting these things. Good grief. They're going to really, regulations are going to clamp down on us. And what does it turn out? They're good for people. If you live according to them, you'll live to a ripe old age or have a better chance. Your neighbor won't shoot you because you're running around with his wife when you're 23. See, it promotes longevity. You'll be, you'll respecting your parents, you'll live to the longer. You see, because you're respecting ultimately the authority of God. You have a more stable society. Everybody's happier. But you have rules, you have regulations. And by coming from God, there's a little less argument over it because people don't all study philosophy. And they don't all study ethics. And when they do study it, half the time they get it wrong. Probably 9/10 of the time. Point number 4. The natural law, with regard to the natural subject of this authority, it is the people who possess the authority to self-govern. But you always got to remember, don't pervert what that means. It doesn't mean that we can just do anything we want. It means that God has ordained that human beings shall govern themselves by the use of right reason, looking at their own nature and determining what is appropriate according to the common good, and respecting the dignity and the properties of that nature. So yes, the people possess the authority, but it's not a wanton authority. It isn't a positivistic authority where we can do just anything we want. We are obliged to be good. We're obliged to be virtuous. And yes, society is obliged to create conditions in which it is easy for people to be virtuous. Libertarians would say it's not the business of government to tell us what to do. It's not the business of government to tell us what's virtuous. Well, sorry. It is the business of government to create conditions in which virtue can flourish. And you know what? Government can't do it if it doesn't know what it is. So if you have people who are governing who are moral ignoramuses, they're unfit to govern. And anybody who would say that you must conform your conscience to the slaughter of the unborn and an abortion is a moral ignoramus. You can do the syllogism yourself. Point number 5. Authority is delegated to the government. Delegated by the people to the government. Who implements that authority is arbitrary. In other words, you can set up any government you want. If you want a king, have one. If you want a benign dictator, have one. If you want a parliamentary democracy, have one. There's nobody saying that the parliamentary system of Canada is inferior to or superior to the Republic of the United States. These are just different ways of doing it. There probably is an argument, if you sort through it enough, one of them probably is better than the other. But it's up to the people to choose what they want. And if they have an honest disagreement, to have whichever one they want. as long as both forms, or whatever form you take, conforms to natural law and respects human dignity and human rights. That's what matters. Contract theory, which ignores natural law, could, in principle, allow rape as being legitimate, as I mentioned earlier. Because in contract theory, it's whatever you contract with a Leviathan to do, as Thomas Hobbes would say. If you hand over all your rights and so forth to the government or to some king, the Leviathan, Parliament, whatever they do, that's right. And morality proceeds from their acts. Natural law says, no, the morality doesn't proceed from their acts if their acts are contrary to natural law. They've exceeded their authority. It's a non-existent law. At all times, the representatives of the people and the people should be asking themselves, is what we are enacting as law conformable to natural law? You ought to have a natural law commission in Congress. Yeah, good luck.
Yeah.
So at what point does the government render itself illegitimate through abuses of the natural law, perversions, misinterpretation?
But you raise a good question, because obviously, given the limitations of human nature, almost any government you create at some point is going to do that. And then, of course, frankly, you should have a big argument about it. And the people should protest. But that doesn't mean that you defunctionalize the government immediately. I mean, clearly, again, this is a matter of human prudence. It's really a question of when would removing the government do more good than harm. And until that point, you have to work with the government that's there. As reason tells you that. You don't want to do more harm than good. So if the government is doing something that is moderately unjust, even though you protest and you're not being heard, that doesn't mean that you should go out and stage an armed rebellion. You have to make a decision. There can be a point at which things are so perverse and not going to get better that, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary to have a rebellion. I know the British didn't see it that way, but that's basically the course that sometimes has to be taken. And you're right. But you don't do it lightly, and you don't do it easily, and you don't do it precipitously.
Because in this country, we have a Supreme Court that's not elected by the people, it's appointed by our representatives. And when they render a decision like they did in 1973 that allowed systematic mass murder of the unborn, and they stay in power, and we have no way of legitimately removing.
Of course we do. Of course we do.
Not
Of course
in
we
a
do.
expedient fashion.
Absolutely.
But they just legitimize murder on a mass scale.
Well, all you've got
And
to,
we
we
have no
do,
way of opposing them
we,
other than every 4 years we elect representatives who may,
Yes.
when these judges retire, or
Right.
when they
but that's
die off.
an orderly system. That's part of the system. It's not a happy outcome. And indeed, one might ask, does this exceed what is bearable and permissible? And that's something that good men have to debate. But it's part of the system. It's part of what we set up. There is a way to handle it, and the most immediate way would be to vote out the people that put in those kind of justices. They're not going to live forever. All of the 1973, they're all dead, I think.
The other question is, how do we reverse this decision? How do we change this?
You reverse
There's a
it.
mechanism
You reverse
for
it by electing representatives who will appoint justices who respect natural law, and they will reverse it. And you bring a case before them to reverse it. There's always a way to do it. The people are not in shackles, except that they shackle themselves. If they are foolish enough and ignorant enough to elect these kinds of leaders who will make such decisions, what is to help us? You can get rid of those bad justices, you can get rid of a bad president, but how do you get rid of the fools that elected them? I mean, that's what we're here for, to try to find out.
The people have been electing pro-life candidates for 40 years, and it hasn't changed.
Well, obviously not effectively, obviously.
But you gotta, at some point you gotta ask, there's something broken in the system.
Well, okay, you're coming to the prudential question of, are you supposed to have a revolution over it? I can't answer that for you. But the basic principle is you have a structure of government. It does flow from the will of the people, and if the people change their will, they can change the government. And especially, you don't have to have an armed insurrection in a government like the United States or in Canada. You can do it by voting, but the people have to be intelligent enough and informed enough to vote correctly. One of the difficulties is that you have had an educational system for the last 70 years, which has dumbed people down to the point where they're not capable of making good decisions. And you have, that's the other horn I was about to hit, and a media that is absolutely complicit with the false philosophies of those who are governing. This is, we're not living in heaven. We're not in heaven yet. We haven't reached the next world. We're still in a world that is filled with human nature in a fallen condition. And that's what we're struggling with. It isn't fun. It isn't fun. Each one of us has to do our job the best that we can. And that's all that we can do. As Dr. Waters frequently said, I didn't make the world, Lord, I'm just in it. I just live in it. And we do the best that we can. Let's continue here. Point number 7. Self-defense is an exercise of civil authority by yourself when no one else can. In other words, when can you take the law into your own hands? Well, if somebody's trying to kill you here and now, the law is not able to come to your rescue, so you have the right even to possibly defend yourself to the point of resulting in the loss of life of the attacker. Does that mean you can engage in capital punishment? No. But when the civil authorities are not there to protect you, you have a right to self-defense, a natural right to self-defense. But again, following the principle of double effect, you don't have the right to execute your attacker. You only have the right to do what is absolutely necessary to prevent them from killing you, or whatever other issue is at stake. But it is in principle, conversely, that right of self-defense, number 8, ultimately justifies capital punishment. But I don't think we have enough time to pursue that tonight.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com.